Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourself for a story filled with twists, secrets, and the unmasking of a dark family mystery. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Disappearance of the Silver Minstrels. The fog had settled thick upon the village of Marlow by the time Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson arrived, the evening air cool against their skin. The pale lamplight cast long shadows upon the cobbled streets, flickering intermittently as the wind brushed through the trees lining the village square. Holmes's sharp eyes darted between the silhouettes of the houses, their stone facades damp from the lingering mist. "You know, Holmes," Watson began, his voice tinged with curiosity as they walked toward the Greystone Manor, "there is something unsettling about this place. It feels as if the very air holds its breath." Holmes gave a slight nod, his gaze fixed ahead. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely the reason we've been called here. There's a certain tension in the air, one that I've learned to recognize. It is not simply the fog, nor the peculiar quiet of a remote village. It is something more insidious." The faint echo of their footsteps was the only sound to break the silence. As they approached the imposing Greystone Manor, its dark silhouette loomed against the twilight, windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. A large iron gate creaked as it swung open to reveal a meticulously maintained garden, its hedges trimmed with unnatural precision. "The Greystones," Watson remarked, glancing at the estate. "Such a wealthy family. Their name is known far and wide." Holmes did not reply immediately, his sharp mind already taking in every detail. The strange stillness of the air, the overgrown ivy creeping along the walls, the unnerving quiet that seemed to envelop everything. The manor stood like a monument to wealth and history, yet there was a subtle weight to it, a heaviness that suggested something far more sinister beneath its surface. They were greeted at the door by a servant, who led them inside. The manor's interior was equally grand, with high ceilings, rich tapestries adorning the walls, and a fireplace that crackled with a warm, comforting fire. But the warmth of the hearth could not entirely mask the tension that lingered in the room. Lady Eveline Greystone stood at the far end of the drawing room, her figure silhouetted by the flickering firelight. Her eyes were wide, her hands wringing the fabric of her gown, betraying an anxiety that could not be concealed by her otherwise composed appearance. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice a soft tremor as she stepped forward. "I am so grateful you could come. Please, do sit. There is much to discuss." Holmes took his usual seat, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He noted the trembling of her hands, the tautness in her posture. Something was amiss, something far darker than her words suggested. And there, in the corner of the room, stood Lord Henry Greystone, tall, imperious, his gaze distant and aloof, as though he could scarcely be bothered to acknowledge their arrival. Holmes's eyes briefly flickered to Lord Henry before returning to Lady Eveline. "Madam, I understand you have an issue that requires my expertise." Her gaze shifted uneasily to her husband before she answered. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It is the disappearance of something most valuable to us. Something I fear may be gone for good." Lord Henry, from his corner, snorted in disdain. "A trinket, Eveline. Nothing more than a bauble of no great significance." The tension in the room thickened as Lady Eveline's hands clenched, her knuckles white. "It is more than that, Henry. It is our family's legacy, the Silver Minstrels, handed down through generations." Holmes's gaze sharpened at the mention of the minstrels. Silver minstrels, an heirloom of such considerable worth and importance. Such an object, hidden away in the manor, could very well be the source of any number of secrets. "A family heirloom, you say?" Holmes inquired, his voice measured, his mind already turning. "And you believe it has been taken?" Lady Eveline nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes. It was here, in this very room. But now, it is gone. I fear someone has stolen it, and we have no idea who or why." Holmes stood, moving toward the fireplace where the faint glow of the fire illuminated the room. His fingers brushed lightly across the polished surface of a nearby table, inspecting its fine craftsmanship, though his mind was elsewhere. "I must see the room where the minstrels were kept," he said. The Greystones exchanged a glance, and then Lady Eveline motioned for him to follow. Holmes turned, his coat swishing behind him, and Watson, ever the loyal companion, followed suit. They were led up a grand staircase and down a long hallway, its dark wood panelling gleaming faintly in the firelight. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Lady Eveline stopped before a door at the end of the hall, and opened it slowly, revealing a spacious room adorned with rich tapestries and an ornate glass display case that sat at the centre. "It was here," she said softly, her voice a mix of despair and disbelief. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the empty case. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had broken in. And yet, the absence of the minstrels was undeniable. He crouched beside the case, inspecting the lock with his usual precision. "No signs of tampering," he muttered. "Curious." Lady Eveline stepped closer, her eyes darting nervously from Holmes to the empty display. "Do you think someone inside the house could have taken it?" Holmes rose and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That is what we must determine, madam." As Holmes stood there, the weight of the mystery settled in. There was something more to this than a mere theft. The calm exterior of the Greystone family belied the tension and secrets that festered within these walls. Holmes could feel it now, a presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. Turning back to the room, Holmes surveyed the area once more. "I will need to speak with everyone involved. No detail is too small. Only then will we uncover the truth." The fog outside grew thicker, and the night pressed on as the first clues began to take shape. Holmes knew, with a certainty that cut through the lingering chill, that this case would not be solved by mere observation alone. There was a story here, one buried beneath layers of deception, and he would unravel it, no matter the cost. The morning light spilled weakly through the curtains as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson settled in the drawing room of Greystone Manor. Lady Eveline, after a night of fitful rest, had arranged for them to meet the remaining members of the household. The atmosphere was still thick with the weight of the disappearance, but Holmes's expression remained unreadable, his mind already shifting toward the inevitable questioning. Holmes sat near the window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he gazed out at the misty landscape. Watson, ever the companion, observed Holmes's silent calculation, knowing that his friend was already beginning to piece together the fractured puzzle before him. The subtle unease in the room was palpable, the morning still too quiet after the storm of last night's revelations. At last, the door to the drawing room opened, and the first of the key players entered. A tall, striking woman with piercing blue eyes, her features sharp but undeniably graceful. She wore a simple yet elegant black gown, the fabric flowing like water around her slender frame. It was clear, from her poised entrance and the air of refinement that she exuded, that she was no stranger to high society. "Miss Althea Greystone, the niece of Lady Eveline," the servant announced softly, stepping aside to allow her to enter fully. Althea's gaze swept the room, resting briefly on her aunt, before landing on Holmes. There was something unreadable in her expression, an intensity that seemed both warm and distant at once. She offered a small, polite nod to Holmes and Watson before seating herself, her movements deliberate, almost calculated. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said with a soft, measured voice. "It is a most unfortunate occasion that brings us together." Holmes gave a brief nod in return, his sharp eyes studying her carefully. "Indeed, Miss Greystone. We are, however, fortunate to have your presence. I trust you can shed some light on the situation." She tilted her head slightly, as though considering his question with careful deliberation. "I can only speak to what I know, Mr. Holmes. My aunt and uncle have been most generous in allowing me to stay here. But in all honesty, I am unfamiliar with the details of the disappearance. Her eyes flickered toward her aunt, a brief moment of tension passing between them, before she returned her gaze to Holmes. I see, Holmes replied, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. And have you noticed anything unusual recently, Miss Greystone? Any behavior? Any changes in the household? Althea's lips parted as if she might answer, but the words were interrupted by another entrance, the abrupt arrival of Lord Henry Greystone. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his face framed by dark, sharply cut features. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, as he crossed the room with an air of superiority. Holmes, Lord Henry greeted curtly, his tone dismissive. I trust you've had your fill of idle pleasantries. Holmes did not react to the implied insult, his gaze shifting only slightly toward the man. Lord Greystone, he acknowledged, his voice as cool as ever. I had just been discussing the situation with Miss Greystone. Perhaps you can provide further insights. Lord Henry's eyes narrowed at the mention of his niece, but he turned his attention to Holmes without hesitation. I fail to see how Miss Greystone's observations are relevant, but if you insist... His voice was clipped, carrying a palpable air of irritation. I've no doubt that whatever has happened with the minstrels will be resolved swiftly. It is of little consequence, really. Holmes observed Lord Henry closely, his keen eyes catching the subtle twitch in the man's jaw. There was more beneath his flippant attitude than he let on. Holmes's interest deepened, as did his suspicion. The minstrels were not simply a family treasure. They were part of something far more intricate, something that Lord Henry appeared to want to distance himself from. And yet, it seems to be of considerable consequence to your wife, my lord, Holmes replied, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of pointed observation. I gather from her distress that the matter weighs heavily on her. At this, Lord Henry's demeanour shifted, though only slightly. He was a man of few words when it came to emotions, and the mention of his wife seemed to strike a nerve. Eveline tends to exaggerate, he muttered, though the words held a defensive tone. It's merely an object, a trinket. Miss Greystone raised an eyebrow at her uncle's words, but remained silent. Holmes could feel the tension in the room thickening. Althea, ever the composed figure, seemed to regard her uncle's response with quiet disdain, her posture stiffening as though she were preparing to challenge him. Holmes's eyes flicked between the two Greystones, noting the undercurrent of conflict that simmered beneath their polite words. Lord Henry's cool detachment contrasted sharply with Lady Eveline's anxiety, and Althea's restrained hostility hinted at something more complex. I see, Holmes said at last, breaking the silence. A family divided by differing views on what matters most. Yet, there is one thing I find particularly curious. He turned his attention back to Miss Greystone. Your absence during the night of the disappearance, Miss Greystone. Did you stay in your room the entire time? Althea blinked, her composure unshaken. I did. I had no reason to leave. My aunt and uncle were already in bed when I retired. Did you hear anything unusual? Holmes pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. Althea hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. No, Mr. Holmes. I heard nothing. Though, she added, her voice tinged with a trace of curiosity. I did see a figure by the window of my aunt's room earlier in the evening, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Lord Henry's expression faltered for a brief moment before he masked it with a half-hearted chuckle. Nonsense, Althea. You must have imagined it. Holmes, however, had already caught the subtle shift in Lord Henry's demeanour. It was enough to further pique his interest. There was something in the air, something elusive, like the faint scent of something foul just below the surface. I believe, Holmes said quietly, that the answer may not lie in what we know, but rather in what we have yet to uncover. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of his words settling over them. The characters around him shifted uncomfortably, the tension mounting as Holmes continued to watch them with his penetrating gaze. Each small exchange, Each slight gesture added another layer to the puzzle that was already beginning to form in his mind. The following morning, the air had shifted, thick with the promise of rain. The sky above Greystone Manor was a dull grey, the light seeping through the clouds like a veil of fog that muffled the sounds of the world beyond. It was in this oppressive silence that Holmes and Watson were summoned once more, their footsteps echoing down the manor's grand hallway as they were led to the drawing room, where the Greystones awaited. Holmes's eyes scanned the room as they entered, already sensing the heightened tension. Lady Eveline was seated in a chair near the fire, her fingers trembling in her lap. Lord Henry, however, stood by the window, his back turned, gazing out into the yard with a look of resignation on his face. Miss Althea was nowhere to be seen, her absence, though noted, hardly surprising. "What is it?" Holmes asked, his voice cutting through the thick air. Lady Eveline rose slowly, her expression pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes, there has been another development." Her voice cracked, betraying the fear that gnawed at her. "The Minstrels, they're gone." Holmes froze, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before it was quickly replaced by a calm composure. He could sense the gravity of the situation, a far deeper mystery than the mere theft of a silver relic. Lady Eveline's distress was tangible, and the faint smell of burnt wood from the fire did nothing to alleviate the growing sense of unease. "Gone?" Watson repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "But we had already seen the empty case." "Yes," Lady Eveline whispered, "but this time it is different. The room, it's been completely turned over. There are signs of a struggle. Something is terribly wrong." Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his mind already calculating the next course of action. He gestured for Lady Eveline to lead them to the scene, his every movement deliberate as he walked past her. Watson followed close behind, casting a concerned glance at the woman who appeared on the verge of collapse. They were led through the same grand hallway as before, the floorboards creaking beneath their weight as they made their way toward the exhibit room. The once stately hall seemed colder now, the walls pressing inward as if to constrict the very air they breathed. As they approached the door, Holmes could hear the faint rustle of fabric, Lady Eveline's soft sobs reaching his ears. Yet he remained resolute, his mind still spinning, analysing every nuance, every change in the environment. The room was a stark contrast to its earlier state. Where before it had been neat and organised, a certain order to the display, now it appeared as though a storm had swept through. The shelves were overturned, objects scattered across the floor in a haphazard mess. The glass display case had been smashed open, shards of broken glass glittering like jagged teeth under the dim light. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was an odd stillness, a deliberate nature to the disorder. Holmes bent down, inspecting the debris with his usual precision. His eyes narrowed as he observed the placement of the items, the specific way in which certain objects had been upended. It was not simply a thief in a hurry. No, this was something more. The minstrels, he noticed, were indeed absent, but there were no other immediate signs of theft. No other valuables appeared to have been taken. And yet, the way the room had been disturbed seemed intentional. "Watson," Holmes called, his voice low as he crouched beside a shattered cabinet. "Take note of this. Whoever did this was not searching for riches. The minstrels were the goal, nothing else. And yet, something feels off. The absence of the minstrels is important, yes, but the state of this room, it suggests more." Watson, who had been quietly observing the scene, nodded, though his face betrayed his confusion. "You think this wasn't just a burglary?" Holmes stood and slowly circled the room, his mind working at a feverish pace. "No, my friend. This was no common thief. This was personal. The room has been ransacked in such a way that it feels like a message, an emotional reaction. The minstrels were not just taken, they were stolen for a reason. And that reason, I fear, is not one we have yet uncovered." Lady Eveline, standing at the threshold of the room, clutched the doorframe for support. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but she found herself at a loss for words. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, flicked toward her husband, who stood in the doorway behind her. Lord Henry's face was impassive, though his gaze seemed to linger on the chaos in the room with a trace of unease. "I trust you are beginning to see," Holmes continued, his voice measured but firm. "This is no simple theft, nor is it the work of an opportunistic criminal. Whoever took the minstrels knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted something more than silver." "More than silver?" Watson echoed, his voice skeptical. "But why would someone go to such lengths for an object so seemingly trivial?" Holmes did not immediately answer, instead walking to the far wall, where a faint imprint in the dust caught his attention. He knelt once again, brushing his fingers across the surface. The faint outline of something had been disturbed. The dust shifted as though someone had recently leaned against the wall, or perhaps written something there. His eyes widened, catching something, a faint symbol, barely discernible. "This," Holmes murmured to himself. "This is what I needed." Before Watson could respond, Lady Eveline stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly before her. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her words coming slowly, laden with a mixture of grief and confusion. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes? Do you know who took them?" Holmes rose, his eyes narrowing as he focused on her. "Not yet, madam, but I believe we are closer than we were before. The path is becoming clearer, though the road remains treacherous." The morning after the disturbance in the display room was overcast, a soft drizzle falling against the tall windows of Greystone Manor. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Lady Eveline gathered once again in the drawing room. The air was thick with unspoken tension, though Holmes's demeanour remained unruffled. His mind, already consumed by the case, had yet to slow its relentless pace. Lady Eveline, once again nervously seated by the fire, her hands wringing a handkerchief between her fingers, had not been able to rest since the discovery. She had barely slept, plagued by worry and confusion. Holmes, however, appeared calm, almost detached. He took a seat across from her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face as he spoke. "Madam, we must move with precision. Each moment that passes may bring us closer to the truth, or further away from it," Holmes began, his voice steady. "I need to know everything, no matter how small it may seem. We must examine every possibility." Lady Eveline nodded, her gaze flicking toward the door as though she expected someone else to walk in. But the room remained as silent as it had been for the last hour. It was only after a moment that she finally spoke, her voice quiet and hesitant. I'm afraid I don't know what more I can provide." "I've already told you everything I know," she said, her voice trembling. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his expression softening, though his sharp eyes never lost their focus. "Do not underestimate the importance of even the smallest detail, madam. The slightest change in behaviour, a forgotten conversation, a single oddity, it could make all the difference. You mentioned something about a figure by the window the night before the theft, did you not?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition flashing in her gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "I thought I saw someone, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and the light was dim. I couldn't be sure." "Tell me more about it," Holmes insisted. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief tighter. "I had retired for the night. My husband was already asleep, but I couldn't—" She stopped herself, blinking rapidly. "I thought I heard something. A noise outside. When I went to the window, I saw a figure. A tall man, maybe. He was standing near the garden just outside the light. But when I tried to look closer, he disappeared into the shadows." Holmes's eyes glimmered with interest. "And you saw no more? No sign of who it might have been?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "I tried to look, but the night was so thick with fog. It was like the figure just melted away." Holmes paused, considering her words carefully. There was more to this than the theft of silver minstrels. There was something deeper, something far more unsettling hiding in the shadows of this case. He stood abruptly, his long coat swishing behind him, and moved toward the door. "We must investigate further," he said. "Come, Watson." Watson, who had been quietly observing the conversation, rose and followed Holmes without question. As they made their way down the hall, Lady Eveline trailed behind them, still wringing her handkerchief, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. They reached the garden door. It stood ajar, the heavy wooden frame creaking faintly as it opened. The air was cool, and the faint scent of damp earth clung to everything. Holmes stepped outside, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the eerie stillness. Watson followed closely behind, looking around at the overgrown ivy creeping along the stone walls, the dampness of the garden's pathways seeming to blur in the fog. Holmes stopped near the edge of the garden, where a narrow path wound between a row of tall hedges. He crouched, examining the ground. There were no footprints visible in the soft soil, only the impression of someone, passing close by. The pattern was subtle but distinct. Holmes stood, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he spoke in his usual calm, detached manner. "I believe we may have our first clue," he said, more to himself than to Watson. "What do you mean, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "The figure Lady Eveline saw was not merely standing in the garden. This path, Watson, this very spot, shows a disturbance, perhaps made by someone who passed through here. There is a slight indent in the soil, as though something, or someone, was pressed against the hedges. The figure was here, and they were not just standing. They were watching the manor." Holmes stood, brushing his hands together and wiping off any dirt that remained on his gloves. "This, Watson, is no coincidence. Whoever was watching that night had clear intent, and that intent may very well be tied to the theft." He turned to Lady Eveline, who had lingered just inside the doorway. Her gaze was fixed on Holmes, her face pale and anxious. "This figure you saw, can you remember anything more about it? Perhaps a detail, a movement that caught your eye?" Lady Eveline shook her head, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of uncertainty. No, I'm afraid not. It all happened so quickly. But I do recall a flash of light, something reflective. It seemed odd, but I thought it was just a trick of the fog." Holmes's expression remained focused, but something in the back of his mind clicked. He turned toward the manor once more, his eyes narrowing as his thoughts rapidly connected the pieces. "A flash of light," he murmured. "Reflective, you say? That might be the key to understanding what happened here." He turned abruptly, heading back toward the manor with purpose. The clues were beginning to accumulate, though the full picture remained just out of reach. Yet Holmes could feel it in the air. The answer was drawing closer. His instincts told him that the key to unlocking this mystery lay in the shadows of Greystone Manor itself. Each clue brought him one step nearer to the truth. The following afternoon, the air outside had grown heavy with a storm on the horizon. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window panes of Greystone Manor, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Inside, Sherlock Holmes, with his ever-calm demeanour, had begun his methodical questioning of the key figures in the household. Watson, ever the observer, sat at the far end of the room, carefully watching Holmes's every move, though his mind was racing with questions of his own. Something about the case seemed increasingly strange, as though the pieces were not quite fitting together. Lady Eveline had just exited the room, having provided what little she could, leaving Holmes to continue his investigation without her distractions. Lord Henry and Miss Althea now stood before him, the tension palpable. The room itself seemed to shrink under the weight of their silence, the flickering firelight casting deep shadows across their faces. Holmes stood as the two Greystones entered, his gaze flickering first to Lord Henry, whose stiff posture remained unchanged, then to Althea, who stood slightly apart, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had a quiet intensity about her, an air of restraint that Holmes found intriguing. "Lord Henry, Miss Greystone," Holmes began, his voice even, yet purposeful. I must insist on hearing your accounts again. It is essential that we clarify every detail. Lord Henry's lips twitched into a thin, humourless smile. I've already given you all the information I can, he said tersely. The minstrels were stolen. My wife is upset, but I fail to see the need for this drawn-out interrogation. Holmes's gaze never wavered. Indeed, Lord Henry, but I find it hard to believe that such an event could be so easily dismissed. I would appreciate your cooperation. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, perhaps unease in Lord Henry's eyes, but it was quickly masked. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid. I've nothing to hide. Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging Lord Henry's response without agreeing with it. His eyes then turned to Miss Althea, who had remained silent, observing the exchange. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Holmes could detect the subtle tension in her stance, the way her fingers drummed nervously against her elbow. Miss Greystone, Holmes continued, you were present in the house the night the theft occurred, correct? Perhaps you noticed something unusual, something that might have escaped the attention of others. Althea's gaze flicked toward her uncle, then back to Holmes. For a brief moment there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that made Holmes pause. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as though calculating the consequences of each. I was in my room that night, Althea said slowly, her voice measured, though there was a faint tightness to it. I did hear strange noises. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it was as though someone was moving through the halls. Moving through the halls? Holmes asked, leaning forward slightly. Can you be more specific? What sort of movement? Althea shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her arm. I couldn't say exactly. It was too faint to make out. But I thought I heard footsteps, maybe. The creak of the floorboards. And did you investigate these sounds? Holmes asked, his voice steady but intent. No, she replied quickly, her eyes shifting away for the briefest of moments. I stayed in my room. Holmes gave a slight nod, processing her words. You did not think to check the source of these sounds? Or at the very least alert someone? Althea bit her lip, a fleeting moment of uncertainty passing over her face. I didn't want to disturb anyone. It was late. I thought I might be mistaken. Holmes's sharp eyes flicked to Lord Henry, who now shifted his weight, as though uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. His gaze hardened as he spoke, his voice taking on a more forceful tone. Miss Greystone tends to be an imaginative young woman, Mr. Holmes. I would not place too much stock in her intuition. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps not, Lord Henry. But the fact remains that Miss Greystone heard something, and I intend to learn what it was. Althea's gaze snapped to her uncle, a quick flash of irritation crossing her face before she masked it. I'm not a child, Uncle. I'm simply telling you what I heard. And as for the matter of the minstrels, I believe my uncle is correct. It is, after all, just an object, isn't it? Her words, though calmly spoken, carried a certain finality, an attempt to quell further investigation. Yet Holmes could sense the underlying tension beneath her polite demeanour. There was something more to Althea's words, something she wasn't saying. He paused, observing her closely. An object, Holmes repeated softly. Yes, an object that has now disappeared under the most peculiar circumstances. But an object whose disappearance has already created rifts within this family, hasn't it? Tensions that I'm sure have been bubbling long before the minstrels were taken. Lord Henry scoffed, his frustration becoming apparent. Now you're turning this into something it is not, Holmes. You're grasping at straws. Holmes tilted his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Am I? Or am I simply acknowledging the obvious? A family, driven by old rivalries, by secrets, by resentments. A stolen heirloom is the perfect catalyst for these things to surface. Althea stiffened, her lips parting to retort, but she remained silent, her emotions clearly at war within her. Holmes could feel the tension rising like a storm cloud overhead, threatening to break at any moment. "And yet," Holmes continued, his voice calm, "one can't help but wonder, who benefits most from this theft?" Lord Henry shifted again, clearly irritated, while Althea's posture grew even more rigid. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying an edge of anxiety now. Holmes turned his piercing gaze on her, his expression unreadable. "I mean, Miss Greystone, that you might just have more to do with this than you're letting on." The room fell into a heavy silence. Holmes stood still, watching her intently, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant murmur of the storm outside. The storm had finally arrived with an explosive rumble of thunder that shook the walls of Greystone Manor, casting long shadows that stretched across the room like tendrils of darkness. Inside, the atmosphere was equally charged. Sherlock Holmes paced slowly before the fireplace, the glow from the flames dancing across his features as he mulled over the recent interviews. Watson sat across from him, a concerned frown on his face, still processing the maze of contradictions they had uncovered. Lady Eveline, her face drawn from the stress, had retired to her room, and Holmes had requested that Lord Henry and Miss Althea remain for a final round of questioning. Holmes's mind was like a finely tuned instrument, each new detail acting as a note in an unfolding symphony of mystery. The inconsistencies in their stories were starting to weave a web of suspicion that Holmes could not ignore. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, each one wrapped in layers of subtle deceit and hidden motives. "I must admit, Watson," Holmes began, his voice quiet, but his eyes sharp with the intensity of his thoughts, "there is something distinctly wrong here. Lady Eveline, though anxious, has been transparent in her fear. It is Lord Henry and Miss Greystone who trouble me." "What do you mean, Holmes?" Watson asked, leaning forward in his chair, his brow furrowed with curiosity. Holmes paused by the fire, his eyes flicking to the shadows in the corners of the room, as though contemplating their secrets. "Lord Henry has been dismissive from the start, unwilling to give much attention to the theft. His aloofness, his disregard. There is more behind it than mere indifference. It suggests that he knows something we do not." Watson shifted uneasily. "Do you think he's involved?" Holmes turned, meeting Watson's gaze with an unreadable expression. "I cannot say yet, but his reluctance to engage with the investigation seems more than a simple lack of interest. I believe it is a carefully cultivated facade. The Minstrel's disappearance is significant, perhaps too significant to him for it to be dismissed so easily." "And Miss Greystone?" Watson asked, his voice lowering with a hint of suspicion. Holmes's lips curved into a thin, contemplative smile. "Miss Althea. She is, I believe, the key to much of this. Her answers were careful, too controlled. And her reaction when I suggested she might have a greater involvement was revealing." Holmes paused, moving toward the window, where the storm outside cast a pale light across the manor's gardens. "She's hiding something, Watson. I don't believe she was just an innocent bystander. There is an edge to her behavior that betrays her emotions. Restraint, yes, but also a sharpness, a veiled aggression in her responses." As Holmes stood there, his mind racing through the fragments of their conversation, Watson remained silent, the weight of Holmes's deductions sinking in. The storm outside had begun to rage in full force, but inside the manor, the storm was brewing in an entirely different sense. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed louder now, marking the passage of time with an ominous beat. The case had deepened, the shadows stretching further. "We cannot ignore contradictions, Watson. They are the cracks in the facade that we must exploit," Holmes said, his voice low, as though speaking to himself. He turned abruptly, walking back toward the centre of the room, his eyes narrowing as he faced Watson. "Lord Henry's nonchalance about the theft points to a deeper issue. He may be trying to distance himself from the Minstrel's value, but I suspect his true interest lies elsewhere." Watson's brow furrowed. "But if he is so dismissive, then why?" Holmes's gaze flickered to the staircase leading to the upper floors. Perhaps he has more to lose than he lets on. It's possible that Lord Henry is not as indifferent as he appears. There's a fear, a subtle terror, beneath his aloof exterior. The theft of the minstrels may have far more profound implications than a simple loss of wealth. But what about Miss Greystone? Watson asked, his voice growing more urgent. Why would she lie about hearing footsteps? Holmes's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained unwavering. Because, Watson, she didn't simply hear footsteps. I suspect she saw something, or someone. Her unwillingness to elaborate, to give further detail, is not an innocent lapse. She's holding back information. Do you think she knows who took them? Watson asked, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. I believe she does, Holmes replied, his voice certain. But the question is why she hasn't said anything. The answer lies within her family's dynamics. There is something between her and Lord Henry, something that connects them to the theft of the minstrels, but neither is willing to reveal it. And that, my dear Watson, is the crux of the matter. Watson paused, considering Holmes's words carefully. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form, but they were still disjointed, scattered like the broken glass in the display case. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the door, as though sensing the impending arrival of the very answers they sought. It is time we press them further. The contradictions in their stories must be examined under closer scrutiny. We must not allow them to control the narrative. As Holmes turned to make his way toward the door, Watson followed, the weight of his words pressing down on him. They were not just investigating a theft anymore. They were peeling back the layers of a far more intricate, far more dangerous game. And with each new contradiction, the truth became clearer. The storm outside had not abated, its fury matched only by the relentless churning of Sherlock Holmes's thoughts. The house felt smaller now, its once vast rooms closing in on him as he sat in the drawing room, the fire crackling faintly before him. Watson had retired to his study, but Holmes remained in the quiet, consumed by the threads of the case that seemed, at last, to be weaving together. Holmes rarely allowed himself the luxury of reflection, but as he sat there, his mind retraced the steps of the investigation once more. The contradictions, the conflicting statements, the quiet tensions between the Greystones. It was all too clear now, though not in its entirety. Yet he could see the shape of the truth, just beyond his grasp. The scent of burning wood, warm and inviting, mingled with the cold dampness of the rain-slicked windows. Holmes had long since grown used to the sound of the storm, though it seemed to intensify as his thoughts did, each rumble of thunder reflecting the turmoil in his mind. His fingers, ever so nimble, drummed lightly against the edge of his chair, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames as they flickered in the hearth. Watson, Holmes murmured aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. It is all coming together. The pieces were there, scattered across his mind like a jigsaw puzzle, but he had yet to fit them together. What could tie Lord Henry, Miss Althea, and Lady Eveline to the theft of the minstrels? Why had the theft escalated so quickly, with the family at odds, each person's behaviour seemingly more erratic with every passing day? Holmes rose from his chair, moving with purpose toward the desk where he had laid out his notes. As his fingers flicked through the various pages, he paused on one. Miss Althea's statement about hearing footsteps. It had bothered him since the moment she had spoken it. She had not said she heard someone walking in the halls. She had said she thought she had heard something. A discrepancy that, at the time, seemed minor, but now it felt like a crack in the facade. Holmes returned to the centre of the room, pacing back and forth slowly, his mind whirring with connections. The footsteps she had heard. Did they belong to the thief, or was she covering something else? Her hesitancy in her responses suggested she knew more than she was letting on, but it also told him she wasn't entirely certain. Perhaps she had not seen the thief at all. Perhaps, he reasoned, she had only seen the aftermath. As he thought further, another key piece fell into place. The symbolic nature of the minstrels was not lost on him. Lord Henry's dismissive attitude, the way he had tried to downplay the significance of the stolen object, was an attempt to distance himself from its value. It wasn't just silver. The Minstrels were part of a much larger family legacy, tied to the Greystones' past. Holmes knew that some secrets were worth more than gold, and he could sense that whatever lay beneath the surface of this case was far darker than a mere robbery. Lady Eveline's distress, Lord Henry's cold dismissal, and Miss Althea's veiled hostility. They all speak to something deeper, Holmes mused aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the very walls of the manor could hear him. They are connected by something more than the theft itself. Holmes returned to his chair, his mind now racing. He thought of the figure in the garden that Lady Eveline had mentioned, the shadow that had slipped away in the fog. Had it been a random intruder, or had it been someone connected to the family? Holmes had his doubts. He suspected that the true thief had used this figure as a distraction, a shadow to keep the family distracted while they focused on the wrong details. The theft of the Minstrels had been too calculated, too precise. Taking up his pen, Holmes began to jot down notes, forming a theory in his mind. The theft was not just a crime of opportunity, it was one of necessity. Someone had been driven to steal the Minstrels, not for their monetary value, but for their connection to the Greystone family. Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as a realization struck him. "The key," Holmes whispered to himself, his eyes flashing with a sudden clarity. "The key lies in the relationships. The Minstrels were taken not for their value, but to settle a long-buried family conflict." Holmes stood again, his fingers tapping against the desk as he formulated his next step. He needed to confront each of them once more. He needed to press them, push them, until the truth finally came to the surface. Suddenly, a thought struck him. A small detail he had nearly overlooked in the storm of his deductions. The scrap of fabric found near the garden window. The one that didn't belong to any of the Greystones. He had not had time to fully consider it earlier, but now it seemed so important, like a missing link he had neglected. Holmes's gaze snapped to the window, his thoughts swirling. Who had left the fabric behind? And what had it meant? If it was not from the family, then who was in the manor the night the theft occurred? There were more questions now, more layers to peel back, but they were all starting to fit together. Holmes was closing in. The pieces, though scattered, were beginning to connect. Soon, he would have everything he needed to expose the truth. The thief was here, within the walls of Greystone Manor, and Holmes knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the secrets that each of them had tried so desperately to conceal. The house was eerily still as the evening descended upon Greystone Manor, the last rays of daylight slipping quietly beyond the horizon. The storm outside had tapered off, leaving only the faintest echo of rain against the windows. But inside the manor, a different kind of tension filled the air, one of imminent revelation, a pressure that had been building steadily over the course of the investigation. Sherlock Holmes stood at the head of the drawing room, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the suspects seated before him. Dr. Watson sat to one side, a quiet observer, while Lady Eveline, Lord Henry, and Miss Althea Greystone waited with varying degrees of composure. The time for subtlety was over. Holmes had pieced together the clues, and now it was time to reveal the truth. Holmes allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer, letting the anticipation linger, his mind weighing each word he was about to speak. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, the calm before the storm. "It is time," Holmes said, his gaze locking onto each of their faces in turn, "for the truth to come to light." Lady Eveline, pale and weary, shifted in her seat, her hands clasped tightly together. Lord Henry, as always, exuded an air of detachment, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the fire. Miss Althea, however, betrayed none of the calm composure she had maintained throughout the investigation. Her lips pressed together tightly, her fingers curling into fists in her lap, as though bracing herself for what was to come. Holmes took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the family. The theft of the silver minstrels was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a random act. No, this theft was orchestrated with careful precision, and I now understand why. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. Lord Henry, Miss Greystone, Holmes continued, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of accusation. You both believed that by dismissing the theft as a mere trinket, you could divert attention away from what truly matters. But what you failed to see, what you both failed to acknowledge, is the very thing that connects you to the crime. Lady Eveline's hands trembled slightly as she turned toward her husband. Her expression was one of confusion, as though she were piecing together the significance of Holmes's words. Lord Henry met Holmes's gaze, his lips twisting into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. I fail to see where you are going with this, Holmes, he said, his tone laced with a mixture of arrogance and impatience. Holmes did not falter. The silver minstrels were not taken for their value, nor for their beauty. No, they were stolen because of what they represent. A family legacy, one tied to power, wealth, and most importantly, secrets. Lord Henry's eyes flickered, a slight shift in his demeanour that did not escape Holmes. For a brief moment, there was something almost imperceptible in his expression, fear, perhaps, or guilt. I see you understand what I am saying, Holmes said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. The minstrels were not merely an object. They were a symbol of control, of an era long past, but still very much alive in your minds, and it is this very symbol that drove the theft. Holmes turned to Miss Althea, his gaze now sharp and focused. You, Miss Greystone, had the most to gain from the theft, but I also believe you are not the only one who sought it. You had an accomplice, someone who knew the significance of the minstrels and their value to your family. Althea's breath caught in her throat, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as Holmes spoke. For a moment, it appeared as though she might deny it, but her gaze flickered briefly toward her father. It was all the confirmation Holmes needed. I believe, Holmes said slowly, that Lord Henry too was involved in the theft, but not for the reasons you might think. His indifference, his dismissal of the value of the minstrels, was a well-practiced facade. The truth is, the two of you conspired together to steal the minstrels to settle a much older score, one that has festered between you both for years. A sharp breath escaped Lady Eveline's lips, and for the first time since the beginning of the investigation, she spoke. No, that's not possible, she said, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between her husband and daughter. What are you saying, Holmes? What is this about? Holmes looked at Lady Eveline with a soft but knowing expression. You, Lady Eveline, are the key to understanding this family's dark history. Your husband and daughter sought the minstrels because of their connection to an old financial scandal, one in which your name was implicated. The theft was meant to remove that link, to erase the past. Althea stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. That's not true, she hissed, her voice tight with restrained emotion. You don't know what you're talking about. But Holmes pressed on, his gaze unwavering. I do, Miss Greystone. I've pieced together the clues, the tension between you and your father, the strained relationship between you and Lady Eveline, the motivations hidden behind your every action. The theft was not just about the minstrels. It was about silencing the past, erasing a mistake that should never have been made. Althea stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger, but Holmes's words had already taken hold. She opened her mouth, but her words were lost in the silence that followed. Holmes's voice softened as he addressed Lord Henry. And you, Lord Henry, are not the first to be entangled in such a scandal. But your role in this crime was born out of fear, the fear of what might come to light if the past were ever uncovered. The room seemed to close in on the Greystones as Holmes spoke, each word unravelling the tightly wound fabric of their lives. The air was thick with the weight of the revelation, the storm outside no longer a match for the storm within the walls of the manor. Secrets, lies, and betrayals had finally come to the surface, and the Greystones stood exposed before him. Miss Althea collapsed back into her chair, her face pale as she realised the magnitude of what had been exposed. Lord Henry stood motionless, his expression a mixture of fury and resignation. Lady Eveline, on the other hand, was silent, her eyes wide as she processed the depth of her family's secrets. Holmes took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the three of them. The truth is now known. The minstrels were taken to silence the past, but it is the future that will decide the consequences of your actions. The air in Greystone Manor had shifted. Where there had once been tension, there was now an overwhelming silence, the oppressive atmosphere of the storm outside now matched only by the quiet within. The three Greystones sat before Sherlock Holmes, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with the weight of the truth they could no longer deny. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, yet it seemed unable to dispel the chill that had settled over the family. Holmes stood across from them, his posture unwavering, though there was a quiet melancholy in his gaze. He had done what he set out to do, expose the truth, uncover the hidden motives, and unravel the lies that had bound the Greystones together in a web of deceit. Yet even as he stood there, knowing that justice had been served, there was no satisfaction in the outcome. The case had been a battle of wills, but the cost had been greater than he had anticipated. Lady Eveline's voice broke the silence first, soft and fragile. "What will happen to us now?" she whispered, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Holmes glanced at her, his expression neutral. "The law will take its course. The theft of the minstrels was not just a crime against property, but a crime against family and trust. What comes next is not for me to decide, but I do believe that the truth will bring its own consequences." Lord Henry, whose earlier bravado had long since crumbled, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His voice was quieter now, lacking the arrogance it had once carried. "And what about us?" he asked, the weariness in his tone impossible to ignore. "Is there any hope left for our family?" Holmes studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "Hope, Lord Henry, is a fragile thing. It depends on the willingness to change, to confront the past and the future alike. The Greystones have been steeped in secrets for far too long. Whether you find redemption, or continue to hide behind your facades, is entirely up to you." Althea, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, finally lifted her gaze from her lap, her eyes red-rimmed from the weight of the revelations. "And what of me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Will I be punished for what I've done? For helping my father?" Holmes interrupted her, his tone firmer now, though there was no malice in it. "You acted out of fear, Miss Greystone, and that much is clear. But fear cannot justify actions that harm others. You too must face the consequences, though how they manifest will be decided by those whose trust you have broken." The room seemed to grow colder with each word, the silence stretching between them like a tangible thing. Holmes turned toward Watson, who had been watching silently from the corner of the room, his gaze sympathetic yet understanding. Watson stood, his brow furrowed with concern as he moved closer to Holmes. "I believe it's time, Sherlock," Watson said gently, breaking the silence. "We've done what we came here to do." Holmes nodded, his face a mask of calm. "Yes, Watson, the truth has been revealed, and now it is time for the Greystones to face their own reckoning." Lady Eveline's eyes filled with tears as she looked between her husband and daughter. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice thick with grief. "We've destroyed everything. Our family, our name. It's all gone." Holmes did not answer her immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, gazing out at the darkened sky. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the consequences of our actions catch up to us. No one is immune to that." He took a deep breath, his sharp mind already turning to other matters. But still, the weight of the case lingered, the bittersweet feeling of having solved a puzzle without finding any real victory. The Greystones were broken, and whatever happened next, they would never be the same. Watson, sensing his friend's quiet contemplation, placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done what you could, Sherlock. The rest is beyond your control. Holmes turned to face Watson, his expression softer now, though still thoughtful. Perhaps, Watson. Perhaps. But there are cases where even the truth cannot undo the damage that's been done. In the end, it's not just about solving the mystery. It's about understanding the human heart. And that, my dear friend, is a far more complex puzzle. As the two men stood in silence, the crackling fire in front of them seemed to be the only sound in the room. The Greystones, once a powerful family, now sat in the aftermath of their own downfall. Lady Eveline, her tears now silent, looked to the fire with a distant, haunted expression. Lord Henry's gaze, too, was fixed somewhere beyond the room, lost in thought. And Miss Althea, with her hands trembling in her lap, appeared as though she might break at any moment. Holmes's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer, but then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his coat swishing behind him. Watson followed closely, casting one last look at the family before stepping into the hallway. The storm outside had passed, and the night was still, but in the silence of Greystone Manor, there was no peace. Only the quiet remnants of a family torn apart by their own secrets.